I come to you not as an expert on the media, but as a lifetime consumer of the media and a teacher who teaches my students to critically engage with the media. So what we will be doing is looking at my reflections on engaging with the media from a Christian perspective. The first thing we need to ascertain is what we mean when we refer to the media. Now, I'm going to look at two forms of the media, the first of which is the mass or broadcast media. And later on, I will look at new developments in the media associated with Web 2 technologies. So the mass or broadcast media, newspapers, radio and television, and film. Now, I don't have time to engage with each of these, so I'll put the emphasis on print media, but be aware that the principles I'm looking at could equally be applied to all sorts of media. So how do we respond to traditional mass media? The first thing we need to understand is it's a largely one-way relationship. You'll notice I referred to myself as a consumer of media. And the reason for that is media, or traditional media, set out to inform, to provide us with facts. But very rarely do those facts exist in isolation. They are usually combined with stories designed to engage us and ways that, or methods that are designed to influence us. And so we need to ask the question, what is this particular article trying to do? What worldview is being presented here? How do I engage with this as a Christian? So when we're looking for the facts, we're looking for the things that are uncontroversial, that are based in reality and are not contested, or generally not contested. Where they're contested, they may be entering into the territory of claims or of stories. What are the things that we are being told that are designed to influence us? What do they tell us about the worldview of the person who has presented the article? As a Christian responder, there are some questions we can ask. What does it tell me about God's world? About creation and God's sovereignty, so those foundational things. Sin and its effects in the world. Redemption, Jesus' death on our behalf, the gospel. Judgment and restoration, the future, for both ourselves, for others. About relationships and about ethics, or what is right and wrong. Now, obviously, quite often these things will overlap, and we'll see that as I work through some articles. So looking at some articles that appeared on a particular day. The first one was an article based on an item on the 7:30 report, where Barnaby Joyce was interviewed about the COVID-19 protests in Melbourne on the day where the protesters arrived at the Shrine of Remembrance. The second one was an article in The Australian by Henry Ergas, Protecting Our Freedom to Protest Peacefully. And the third one by Waleed Ali, Has Solidarity Succumbed to the Rise of Rage? So, looking at those articles, and I am going to oversimplify them a little for the sake of time, we know that one of the facts was that protesters took to the streets in Melbourne over a number of days. Some of those protesters could be clearly linked to the CFMEU or a particular trade union and were protesting against mandatory vaccination requirements on construction sites. The protesters clashed with the police, and some of the protesters were at the Shrine of Remembrance on one of those days. So they are facts that each article agrees happened. Then there are claims. Firstly, the claims made in the Barnaby Joyce article. The Shrine of Remembrance is sacred ground and ought not to be the location of a protest, let alone desecration. So that is telling us something about his values. He values the honouring of those who fought on our behalf. He has a fairly conservative perspective, perhaps. And then, remembering that he is a member of the coalition government, and in fact our Deputy Prime Minister, unless things have changed in the last few weeks, vaccination is required to open up the economy and avoid overrunning health facilities. So very pragmatic as well. So there is an economic imperative for people to be vaccinated in order that life can return to normal and the economy can function, and I guess ultimately the government be re-elected. So a fairly conservative understanding of the world there. Wali Dali. The protest pitted the union against a Labor government. So he's got an understanding of the world that unions and Labor are often seen as one and as being united. Now, realistically, that's probably not the case with the CFMEU, but I don't want to get into discussions about politics per se. The strongest support for the unions came from the coalition. So he's really suggesting that there's an inversion of what you would normally expect here. So being very critical of what he's seeing. There's an absence of the language of solidarity. Now, this suggests that perhaps he thinks solidarity is something that is valuable. So his worldview is perhaps a more left-wing worldview. He recognises the protests were under the banner of freedom, which is a more libertarian concept. So it doesn't quite sit comfortably with all of the other things he's just been talking about. But there were other unions, such as in the health sector, that still favour the common good. So perhaps a more critical worldview and a worldview that is based on an understanding of the world that is a little perhaps more left-wing. And Ergus's argument, the police have a duty to protect property. So we're already getting a fairly conservative viewpoint here as well, I think. There are problematic actions of the government in prohibiting potentially peaceful protests, again suggesting a more libertarian understanding of the world. The use of the emergency powers for this purpose is counter to our rights in a democracy. So very much an emphasis on rights. And that the emergency statutes may need to be reviewed in this light. In other words, again, a critical approach, but this time from a more libertarian kind of approach, a more rights-based approach. Now, I don't want to get into who is right and who is wrong, but what this does is to give us the worldviews that we immediately question and say, well, they're not a Christian worldview. So what might I as a Christian do in this situation? How might I respond? So looking at creation and God's sovereignty. Firstly, people are created in the image of God. Now, none of the articles mention that, but if we think of people as created in the image of God, that changes our perspective perhaps on how critical we are of the different people involved, of the different actors, of the people expressing their opinions, both in the articles, but also in the protests. So all of these people are valuable, and perhaps their opinions are worth engaging with rather than just being critical of. We have stewardship of God's world, or have been given stewardship of God's world. So how do we as people who are acting on God's behalf deal with this situation of conflict? This situation where these worldviews are coming into conflict, and perhaps coming into conflict with our worldview. By the way, I'm not giving you answers, I'm just giving you questions. God is sovereign in all of this, so where is God? Not to suggest that God is not present, but how does God's sovereignty frame our understanding of what is happening? Then looking at sin. Sin obviously leads to conflict. So we live in a world where conflict is rife. So we understand that conflict is going to happen. That disease is going to be present. And so that COVID-19 is a manifestation of sin. It is, in a sense, God's judgment on the world, but let's not get hung up on that in terms of response to a particular situation. But it is a function of a world that has gone awry. That is no longer the world that God created. And we'll come again to judgment in a minute. Redemption, Jesus' death on our behalf, the gospel. So are there any gospel issues here? Is the gospel firstly under threat? Secondly, how do we react as people who know the gospel and want to share the gospel? How can we use this to engage in water cooler conversations, conversations after church that perhaps lead us to the gospel? How do we understand the need for salvation in the context of people who are angry? Where could forgiveness be exercised? We could ask the question, how could Barnaby Joyce react differently in terms of forgiveness? We could ask the question, how can we show forgiveness to the people with whom we may disagree, to people who perhaps have acted outside the law, act outside our worldview? How do we show love? How can we use this to talk about the restoration of relationships? How might these circumstances now be dealt with differently in order to restore relationships rather than to trigger additional tensions? And then looking forward to the future. So judgment and restoration. It does point to the need for change. So the need to change because we are all held accountable and we will all be judged. While we can be thankful for the cross and the fact that we will be judged in the light of Jesus and his sacrifice on our behalf, all human beings are accountable, and each of these people is accountable not just to government, not just to the media, not just to people in Australia, but will ultimately be accountable to God. So how do we deal with that? There are consequences for our actions, both in the here and now and in the future. So how do we deal with that? When we look at relationships, how do we deal with the fact that Scripture talks about being obedient to authority? I respond to these. Let me go back here. Where do we put others first? Is it more important to put others first than our rights? And this is a constant tension when I talk about rights with my students. Rights and responsibilities. Individual rights and rights as a community, or rights to the community and to society. The ethical questions. Is the gospel compromised? What would be godly behaviour and a godly response? And we can look at various passages of Scripture. We can also look at the big picture biblical theology kind of stuff that I've just been talking about. How do we show love for all people created in the image of God? How do we deal with people's sin in this situation and the consequences of sin? So, what might we do in response? Obviously, I've already mentioned water cooler type conversations where we're talking with people about what has happened. There are ways we can interact as Christians with the traditional mass media, both in response to this article, but also perhaps in order to convey the message of the gospel. One way would be to be employed in the media. And there obviously are Christians who are employed in the media and occasionally have the opportunity to present a Christian perspective. We could take out advertisements. We could participate in interviews and forums as the opportunity arises. Various groups can put out press releases. Now, none of these are any guarantee that our perspective is going to be understood in the way in which we would want it to be understood, but they are ways in which we can engage with the media. But again, it's a response that, again, is a one-way communication because it doesn't necessarily mean that there is any direct engagement. We can, of course, and I believe that people do still ring up television stations. We can write letters to the editor, and in the era of Web 2, which I will come to in a minute, we can, in fact, comment on articles. So there are ways of engaging, but we don't necessarily have that two-way engagement. So that to and fro in the marketplace of ideas. But we can try to get ourselves into that marketplace and into the media, as well as just engaging with those people with whom we haven't come into contact. Let me take you to Durham Cathedral in 2008. Reverend Pete Phipps was sitting in the pews reading the Bible. However, he was reading it on his mobile phone. He was asked to leave the cathedral because it was considered inappropriate that he be engaging with his mobile phone in church. The difficulty for us as Christians is how do we engage with a changing media environment? And that is the Web 2 media, not just the ability to access the scriptures on our devices. And I'm someone who has been accessing the scripture on my devices at church for a long while. And I'm pleased to say nobody has asked me to put it away or to leave because I have been engaging in that way. But Web 2 technologies give us a new way of engaging. Things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the list could go on. Because anybody can now be a content creator. We can express our opinions, whatever they may be, and reliability of the sources obviously becomes an issue. So we have the opportunity using Web 2 to actually be the content creators and to be the responders and to engage. Now, I've used this as an example. The Beatles, I think they were a band in the 60s. Sure, they were a band in the 60s. Now, there would have once been an official Beatles fan club. Now, this is a short extract from a Google search on Beatles fan clubs, and you can see that there are at least 5, possibly more, and an awful lot of people who have engaged with each of those fan clubs. But those people engaging, how do we know what they are telling us about the Beatles is accurate? The reality is, unless we fact check it elsewhere, we don't. And that's where engaging with Web 2 media and engaging with other media becomes quite important, because fact checking becomes so much more important. A lot of people will retweet things and will create content with an agenda. We need to question that agenda. We need to think about the worldviews of those who are engaging with these media. Now, looking at the day on which those various articles were published, these things were trending. Q&A, which is an ABC television program, so this was late in the evening. Murdoch riots, which relates to those articles, and particularly in the Murdoch media. There happened to be an earthquake in Melbourne, so there were a lot of people responding to that as well. The Shrine is also a reaction to those protests, and the death of John Elliott. Now, what stands out here is the sheer volume of tweets about any one of these things. It means people are engaging with these, expressing their opinions, sharing their other people's opinions. How do we respond? In engaging with Web 2 technologies, we need to consider the facts. And as I mentioned before, we may need to do some fact checking, which is where traditional media comes in very handy. We need to identify where people are making claims, where they are trying to influence the way we think. As a Christian, we need to ask the questions, what does it tell us about God's world, about creation, about sin, about redemption, creation and God's sovereignty, about relationships, and I've left one out, about judgment and restoration, and about ethics, or what is right and wrong. So once we have established what our perspective is, we can like things that we think correspond with our worldview and we'd like to promote to others. We can share things. We can retweet, we can share things on Facebook that other people have presented. We can make comments and engage in that way. Now, in doing all of these things, we do open ourselves up to the possibility that others may respond to our responses. And whilst we are able to engage, we may also find people critically engaging with us. So we do need to be prepared for the possibility that people will make claims that we don't necessarily agree with, and we may need to further engage with. But we also need to be careful that we engage in appropriate ways and don't get ourselves caught up in engaging in unhelpful ways. We can be content creators ourselves. So we can actually reflect our own opinions and set up our own engagements with particular issues. So we might, for instance, blog, we might be the first person to make a comment, and then other people might start tweeting our comments or retweeting our comments, sharing our comments, liking our comments. Thank you for your time. I hope this has been of assistance in helping you to think through engaging with the media from a Christian perspective.